Welcome everyone to our affordable housing seminar with a focus on prefabrication and off-site manufacturing and the role they maybe play in the affordability crisis. Now I too would like to begin by recognising this as National Reconciliation Week and by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which the university sits, the land of our Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. And now a very special welcome to our guests, JOYCE FERNG, DAMIAN CROUGH and GIORGIO MARFELLA. Now, as Simon mentioned, we'll open up discussion via the Q&A function shortly. But I thought it'd be useful just to kick things off by making an observation of the current state of play. And bear with me, because there is a question at the end of it. And so from the perspective of the Hallmark Research Initiative for affordable housing, I think each of us in the panel would all probably agree that prefabricated housing and off-site manufacturing could have a massive impact on changing the current paradigm in the Australian housing industry. We might all not agree on whether affordability is at play, but the current challenges facing the housing industry are creating an indisputable pressure to innovate and change the way in which house builders are constructing and operating. However, I would suggest that it is not currently on course to do so. The panel, they might disagree, but the government probably holds the key to starting a renaissance in house building with several key things they could implement, but there is arguably a lack of research and evidence to give the government the confidence to change procurement practices and building standards. And now again, the panel might disagree. They might suggest there is enough research that's not been exploited. There is also pressure coming to meet environmental and energy policy targets, with obvious pressure to decarbonise the construction industry. A recent report from the World Green Building Council, for example, calls for urgent and coordinated action to tackle global embodied carbon emissions in the building and the construction sector. Not only is a net zero carbon future vital to minimise climate change, it is clear that it can also provide a competitive advantage for companies. It can also be assumed that the industry would grow exponentially as it would encourage firms to build more manufacturing bases and increase their housing supply and potentially create new jobs. And our famous saying has always been to build your way out of a recession. And with things like the recent announcement of the big housing build and a $5.3 billion investment to kickstart construction, is it the perfect storm to finally amplify off-site manufacturing solutions? Or is it the uncomfortable truth for Australia that we will continue to rely on traditional housing methods, which will perpetuate the crisis? In other words, will we end up making the same mistakes we did over 40 years ago and miss a huge opportunity? And so the question for each of you in the panel to kick off the conversation: can modular construction and off-site manufacturing new assembly techniques play their part in solving Australia's housing crisis? And why has the construction industry been so resistant to modernisation? So quite a few questions to cover, possibly a lack of research, addressing climate change and this idea of a resistance to change within the construction sector. And if you don't mind, JOYCE, I'll maybe throw it open to you to start and kick off that conversation.
Let me unmute myself first. Okay. Yeah, I think very good questions that you've posed, Alan, and it is a very wide range as well. I think we cannot look at things in isolation. I think in the past, we've been just focused on one sector, say housing sector, for example, and this is what we want to do, and this is our target. We're not looking at it holistically enough. We're not tying in with the wider, bigger picture. For example, the sustainability goals that we are all trying to achieve, the United Nations and SDGs. So we need to have a clear direction, a clear leadership from the government to actually map the whole delivery out. So I'm not saying that offsite construction or prefabrication is the answer, to all the solutions. It is one of the, and it is because of technology and innovations that's coming into the market or from the other sectors, we can leverage from it. So yeah, that's my opinion.
Okay, thanks, JOYCE. And Damien, I mean, has the construction industry been resistant to change? You're on mute.
There we go. Yeah. Yes, Alan. I think there have been resistance to change, and I think a lot of that has to do with education and understanding. And from my perspective, from what I've seen over the journey of the last 10 plus years of doing prefabrication, was that a lot of the technology that is being used and being implemented, digital technologies, parametric modeling, generative design, all of these sorts of things are very new within the industry. Most of the people in the industry have been educated prior to much of this being implemented in the industry. So I think there's really a knowledge and skills gap that exists, which needs to be addressed. And that's a big education piece. And, just to give you a bit of background on Prefab Oz and how we came about, I was invited to a University of Melbourne event back in 2012, an ARC linkage grant on future-proofing schools with Claire Newton and Sarah Backhouse and others. And the reason I was invited there was because when I was doing the business development for Hickory Group and their unitised building system, we actually did a little collaborative project with the University of Melbourne where we would take all the final year construction and architecture students and we would take them through the factory, we would give them a tool, we would show them the automation, the robotics and the technology and the digital, DFMA, design for manufacture and assembly, which is now a really common term, or a new one is data for manufacturing and assembly, or data for manufacturing logistics and assembly, DFMLA. So there's all of these terms which are now starting to be standardized and used within the industry that most people probably wouldn't know about because they weren't taught that before they went out into the industry. So I think there's, one of the biggest things for me is still education. And I think that is a big piece for me. The other thing is, around transparency with the government and a pipeline. I mean, you want our manufacturers to invest to grow, but they have no transparency with the pipeline that government has. So if they had that, they would be happy to invest. If they knew there was 1,000 homes or 10,000 homes or whatever the procurement model was, then they would invest to deliver that. And if you look at what's happened with the education sector, with the schools, I mean, our industry is really, really busy delivering those schools because we've been given some really clear understanding of what they want to deliver, not only in Victoria, but in New South Wales and now South Australia. So a lot of our members are building prefab schools and investing and growing because they know what that pipeline is.
It's interesting, Damien, sorry just to cut it, but that's, I think, a fascinating comparison with housing because I think it's something like a third of new schools are prefabricated. Yeah. Yeah,
absolutely. And, that is only going to grow. And it's, it is a significant pipeline and a significant amount of work for our industry, which facilitates investment and, growth in the industry, which is what we're all looking for.
Okay, fantastic. Now, Giorgio, I think that's a perfect segue given the Damian's reference to education. Are we doing enough to educate the future of the construction industry about the opportunities with prefabrication? And then the second question, I suppose, to dovetail in is around research. Is the research there that's required?
Yeah, very good point. I mean, it's very easy to blame universities because, we are in a relatively privileged position. So obviously there's always more need for education anytime. Are university equipped to, say, for example, a faculty of architecture not just the one in which I work with you, Alan, but generally speaking, are the schools of architecture doing enough towards prefabrication? Well, if it's a matter of acquiring skills, I would argue that architects are probably leading the way. Things like digital design, it's now become daily bread, and so we're certainly not behind. But there's more to be done, perhaps, in understanding the role of designers as contributors in the design of products. So arguably, schools of architecture and probably other design schools, generally speaking, are not investing as much in technical knowledge as they could. But so there is definitely the need to shape new roles. So we probably have to learn to think a bit more like industrial designers.
I think, and Giorgio, you make a good point there. I think architecture and design is always the key to the success. And really what also needs to happen is the rest of the industry needs to understand that upfront engagement. And that's something that that really needs to be highlighted. It is a completely different approach to a conventional, traditional type of building, in that the more collaboration, the more upfront design and coordination that happens, the better the outcome. And I think that's a message that we would really try to get out to the industry.
Yes, that's a good point, because prefabrication entails that, generally speaking, there's less time on site, but then you have to offset with a lot more work during the design process. The problem I see in there is that probably we need to think about new roles. So the traditional roles of the architects might have to become more of a project, an industrial designer, as I was saying, or a product designer. And interestingly enough, there's plenty of examples from the past where we could actually recover that model. So in my mind, yes, education is important, Alan, but there's also the need to transfer that. Education, broadly speaking, also in the industry, is the industry educated enough to adopt these models? And you mentioned procurements.
Yeah.
That can be a significant obstacle. I mean, I don't want to now unravel and open a can of worms.
Just hold it there, Giorgio, because I think we'll come back to the research question, but I think, Joyce has written about this whole idea of rethinking the design process and the way designers think. So Joyce, you've been doing quite a bit of work on this from AECOM's perspective.
Yeah, I think very good point that Giorgio brought up. The designers at the moment, the architects and the engineers, they're all very trained to do digital. So it's, digital modeling and all that isn't an issue. But I think the gap in the skill set is actually understanding how these components are actually being put together. So the lacking piece is actually the manufacturing and the assembly component. So exactly what you're saying, Giorgio, we need probably to create a whole new role, or a new skill set for this group of people to be able to bridge it and bring the two, the manufacturing side and the design side together. And from what I see is, in the past, right, what we look at is, we always look at what the building is like. Okay, what is the grid space, and then from there we build the structure, then we build inside. We look at the fittings and the furnitures, and we are zooming in from outside inwards. Now we have to really, really think about design in a different way, completely looking at it as parts, as kits of component or kit of parts, basically. Identify standardization in terms of your modules and plugging it in. So effectively, like a Lego set, you've got your standard pieces that is already digitally enhanced, with all your data embedded in it, with all the systemization that you can put inside it. It's not only just structures we're talking about. We're talking about services that you can embed in it, the architectural finishes. And then from there, you build the pieces, and you can have different configurations with it. So it's not necessarily, the misconception is that if we do offsite, then it has to be a cookie cutter. It has to be all the same, that we need to generate the same type of design. And that is not necessarily so.
No, that's a very good point. It's true that the prefabrication we have today, because Alan, you mentioned about the misperception initially, about the fact that, I think we said it before the seminar started, sorry, I'm probably going too far. But the point, yes, there is a perception that prefabrication creates homogeneous outcomes. That's not the case today. There is variation. There is opportunities for infinite combinations. However, let me raise this analogy. The cars on the streets, they can be of any colors, but you'll find that most of them are SUVs. They're gray, they're white, and then black, because that's what the market wants. So there are examples also where all these potentials in reality might somehow still converge into outcomes that are not necessarily all cookies, all the same, but there's still a risk that eventually the market will conform to a mainstream product, even if it's standardized or mass produced, so that there's more variation.
Can I just come back to Damien actually on something here in terms of just jobs? There's always this conversation about, obviously we've talked here about the impact on the education and the education of the architect, and potentially, I think it's a really fascinating conversation about the evolving nature of the profession. But is one of the issues, Damien, about the kind of resistance to change from the construction industry, about the fear of impacting on existing construction jobs? And is there a counter argument that we're going to create a whole new range of jobs? I mean, we've seen the death of manufacturing all across Australia, and we look at some of our suburbs, your Geelongs, your Broadmeadows, trying to revitalise and reinvent themselves, but there's a real struggle to find new jobs. So how could this potentially play a part in terms of off-site manufacturing?
Yeah, it's a good question, Alan, and I just wanted to say I've got 4 children homeschooling who are on lunch break, so if you hear lots of noise, and it's just them in the kitchen probably breaking stuff. So yeah, look, it's a good question, and sort of from my experience, from what I can talk about, is when we were doing the unitized building, the stuff with Hickory Group and automation, I think the timing was really good because we had the automotive industry closing down, and we were able to identify that the skills that those engineers and project managers had were immediately transferable into off-site construction or construction generally. And so we were able actually to grab quite a few of those engineers and use them within the business to really improve production, productivity, and that was a significant benefit. And so really what we're seeing with off-site construction, prefabrication, is we're seeing this sort of hybrid skill base developing. And so there's not really any course that addresses that. So what you have is you have this need for the design and the project management side of things, but you also need to understand manufacturing and logistics. And that hybrid skill base is going to be, you know, going forward, what's required. Now, we also have members who call me up and say, you know, we're manufacturing buildings, but we don't have any qualified people that can actually install them. And so there's this other skills gap where you now need to have people that understand design, understand manufacturing, and need to understand how to put these pieces together coming from the factory, coordinating with offsite. And so we have previously developed a Cert 3 around that. And, you know, the industry is really screaming out for this. So we're starting to really identify areas where there are skills gap, knowledge gaps, where we can come together, develop hybrid sort of skills. And then going forward, these are the sorts of things that will be desirable, I guess, in the industry for people to want to know, to want to go and learn about this. Because as Giorgio said, you know, all of the digital technologies that's being led by the architects is fantastic, but then we need that to translate into the manufacturing side. And that's really where we see that crossover, and using skills from other industries that are maybe closing down, that may be shrinking, and bringing them into the construction and offsite manufacturing industry to grow our industry.
Yeah. So in some respects, I think, Damien, what you're saying is that prefabricated housing might be a complement to traditional methods. It's not going to completely replace it, but there's going to be, and then there's a hybrid knowledge gap as well that we need to fill.
Yeah. So I think, look, we've never had that concern about offsite taking away from traditional construction. I just don't think that's going to happen. I think things will change and shift a little bit, but you know, there's still considerable amount of work that needs to be done on site, especially in large scale, you know, infrastructure and commercial projects. There's still a significant amount of site work required and skills on site. And so we just see the opportunity to really make the industry safer. So the more work we can do in a safer environment, the better, obviously, and to grow that and to really develop a world-leading set of skills that is going to be the future of the industry.
Yeah. Now I'm just going to go to the Q&A just to pick up a couple of things, because I think, I mean, obviously the title of this seminar was looking at issues of affordability. And one of the questions is this, you know, what part does prefabrication and offsite manufacturing play in the wider kind of housing system and economics? You know, obviously land value, we all know, is one of the biggest drivers to issues of affordability. But there's financing, urban issues, planning, mortgage availabilities and funding, tax plays a big part. So there's a whole complex system there. And I suppose the question we're trying to get to here is, what part does prefabrication play, or can it play? I mean, I read a recent report which suggests that construction costs for factory builds is typically about 12% higher now. You know, things like that are slightly worrying. And I mean, a lot of that's to do with it's probably seen as a specialisation right now and not the mainstream. So again, I just want to open this up. I mean, I know, Giorgio, you've got particular ideas about whether it's a cheaper way of doing things or not, or what part it does play in terms of cost benefit.
Well, I think, you know, I'm probably, you know, Damien, you probably have better data than I could provide about the cost. And my understanding, yes, prefabrication can provide cost benefits. But when you're looking at the problem of housing today, there's a fundamental problem, which is before the cost of construction, which is the cost of the land and the reason for which the stock of housing in Australia is created, which is fundamentally speculative. And so houses are seen more like a financial investments for the upper middle class at the moment. And whereas typically the prefabrication that we encounter historically is the one that has a problem of supply or a problem of skills shortages, or even better, of absolute absence of skills. So Australia, you know, was at the forefront of prefabrication. We started to import, for example, the manning cottages in Western Australia, where there were houses built in the UK that were available for the colonial Australians to set up very quickly. The Americans have done the same historically many times. So there is a problem of using basically prefabrication in order to provide supply in very large quantities. But Australia today, my understanding, doesn't have a problem of supply of housing. We're not building new towns. We need to somehow decouple some of the systems that are producing housing as a form of investment, whereas typically you would want to have houses to be like consumer goods in order to have prefabrication to be somehow worth. And that's what's happening, for example, in Japan. In Japan, there are models that are very successful where houses are prefabricated using this sort of mass produced, but at the same time also open to infinite variations model. And yet, you know, there's a fundamental difference in the market where in Japan, you build a house, the cost of land might not be necessarily as high as in Australia or in Australian cities. You tear down a house and you build a new one. I think we have to address that problem at macroeconomic scale before we can then go back to the fundamental question, how is it going to help affordability?
It's interesting, Giorgio, you mentioned Japan, because I mean, recently Japan's biggest house builder, Sekusi, entered into a venture with the UK government expected to result in, you know, thousands of modular homes all over the country. And so I think it's an interesting thing to see what's happening elsewhere. I mean, there's always, as I say, funding and policy, government policy play a huge part in some of this. But I mean, coming back to Joyce, I mean, in terms of what's happening elsewhere in the world, have we got lessons to learn from others?
Yeah, most definitely. I think, like I mentioned at the beginning, I think it needs a strong leadership from our government to actually push this forward. I think a lot of case studies that we've actually done, for example, in the UK, there are very clear strategic delivery plans. You know, it's all mapped out. There is a pipeline of works, and you know, and the government actually has initiative to assist the industry to progress forward. So I think there's a bit of a lacking on the Australian side, if you make that comparison, that there is no clear vision, there is no clear long-term commitment to actually deliver this. So I think we all collectively need to come to the table, the industry, the academics, and the government, to identify all the key challenges and break it down and map out a whole you know, series of targets and measurables, benchmarking that we can actually follow through. So Singapore as well, you know, the government is a little bit more draconian, obviously, and they do provide incentives for the industry to actually pick up, in a way, mandate them to actually use offsite a lot more. But obviously, their drivers are different, so we need to understand what our drivers are. So Singaporean drivers are, they want to reduce foreign laborers. So they want to increase productivity by doing things offsite. So those are their key drivers. So yes, you're right, Giorgio, it may not be as cheap as you would do it traditionally. It is actually more expensive. But in Singapore's eyes, this is a success. So Hong Kong is following suit as well. Their government are actually pushing their schools, and their hospitals and their public infrastructure works to use what they call the MIC, modular integrated construction, within their design approach. So a lot of examples from various countries where government-led initiative, which is creating the growth and the interest and pushing the offsite industry a lot more forward. Yeah.
Thanks, Joyce. One of the things that someone's asked in the Q&A is in relation to materiality. Obviously, concrete, there's been a lot of scrutiny on the use of concrete now, and cement is a major environmental concern. And then there's a big push for off-site timber construction. But we're also seeing the emergence of discourse around green steel. I'm just wondering, again, Damien, I'll maybe throw this to yourself. What's happening out there in terms of conversations around different uses of timber versus steel?
Thanks, Ellen. Actually, if you don't mind, I might just make a couple of comments about that, just that previous conversation before I get into that. And I think that Japan analogy was good, but the difference is in Japan, prefab is seen as a premium product. Also, you have companies like Toyota building 40,000 houses a year, and they treat their houses like their cars. So they have warranties, they come back and service it for you, they check it, they build a relationship with the client, the customer, and that's something that we don't do. And also, when you talk about the cost, yes, the cost up front may be more, but then, as we know, it's the life cycle of the building where most of the cost is. So although you may pay a little bit more up front, over the life cycle of the building, because you have a better performing building envelope, you have a much cheaper building to run. So just wanted to make that comment around, yes, traditionally you would expect it to be a little bit more upfront, but over the life of the building, you have a better performing, lower cost building. So just, if you could just give me that question again. Sorry, Alan.
Well, sorry, I'll come back. I was going to ask you about materiality, about timber versus steel and some of the changes and shifts that are going on, because green. I want to come back to green steel in a second, but just on that point you made about the performance. I mean, it's become second nature really in the construction industry to consider that operational carbon. So again, going back to this whole issue of environmental opportunities. The idea of emissions related to the energy needed to run a building is something we've all become very familiar with. And, these are the numbers you see in an energy performance certificate of a new home, for instance. However, embodied carbon is still often no more than an afterthought when it comes to the construction industry. So I suppose just going back to this issue of climate change, do you think that climate change, which is coming, it's a global issue, but it's also, it deals with this issue of public perception. People expect now, to have that 6-star rated, if not more. People want to know what their apartment block constructed out of. Is this a game changer, do you think? Do you think the decarbonisation of the construction industry is really going to force a pivot in the way we do things?
Well, I think consumers are much more educated. I think that will drive a lot of change. As I was saying before, when you have a much better performing building, which has used a lot less material, or you have significantly less waste to produce that product. And we've got examples from, and case studies coming out very soon, actually, with Mirvac around some of the housing that they've been doing, 2-story housing, using timber frames, but doing it in a prefab way with cassettes and wall panels and bathroom pods, and it's something like 90% less waste on site. It's significant, it's huge. So when you talk about carbon and you talk about materials, this will make a big difference to our environment. What we have to remember is we only have a finite amount of resources. So at some point we have to start reusing and recycling. And what prefabrication generally allows is the decommissioning, deconstruction, and reuse of buildings and building components, which I think is going to be a significant consideration going forward, where in 50 years' time, instead of tearing something down, you simply deconstruct it, maybe refurbish it and reinstall it in another place for another use. And I think, you know, that deconstruction element to prefabrication is really significant and something that's not being focused on. And just to go to the other question about materiality, you know, I think what's happening and what I'm seeing is that the industry is starting to recognize that different materials have different uses and should be complementary. So, you know, steel and concrete and timber can all go together and they all have their best performance attributes. And I think that's starting to be recognized, where you're starting to put steel and timber together. You know, you're starting to do concrete and CLT, and so use the material where it best performs. Whereas I think in the past, everyone was like, if you're in the concrete industry, everything has to be concrete. If you're in the timber industry, it has to be timber, you know, and same for steel. But I'm starting to see that change, and I think that's being led by research as well. So that's really interesting to see that those changes happening in the industry.
I'll come back to
Yeah,
I was going to say I would come back to Giorgio in a minute on that. Look, Giorgio, we'll come back to that because I think it's an important one to tackle in terms of research and what's happening. But Joyce, I'm just keen to hear again from your experience in industry around this whole life cycle of a building and discussions around materiality.
Yeah, I think our clients are actually also looking into this a lot more. And in terms of offsite construction, there is a lot more interest. So in the past, you know, say five years ago, we have to sell it. You say, oh, would you like to look at an alternative, for example, you know, to use offsite? And there will be a lot of hesitance, and we will have to bring them through a journey. And now what we are seeing in the industry is that the clients are very educated, as Damian pointed out. You know, they come to us and they have their own sustainability goals as well that they would like to achieve. So it's kind of marrying that up with our design approach and our project delivery. So it does make sense. And we are in the design world also looking at a hybrid of materials, as Damian pointed out. It's not just purely very siloed steel structural building or timber building. We're using the materials where it needs to be used in maximizing the benefits of each material. So that's happening within the industry. Yeah.
Great. Giorgio, then, I think that opens up. So are we enough in terms of research and materiality?
I completely agree. I think that the right way out, if you want to somehow improve in the industry, you have to start with what you have, and it's very difficult to implement mono-material solutions. That's in part what I think the timber industry has done, and that there is a reason why that has happened, because traditionally you have the stick frame construction in domestic market, which is dominated by timber, apart from occasionally, but not always, a slab on ground. The work is very much geared towards timber. And so if you try to transpose that model into the commercial sector of multiple housing, you start to find some hurdles. And perhaps the industry needs to understand that you're going to get there step by step. I think the question that you posed initially was the steel versus timber. I don't think that's really so much how it's been framed. It was more like timber versus concrete. Now, the problem with concrete, we all know it, that it's high embodied energy. However, we don't have another concrete. The fact is that concrete is, as Damian said, each material has its own characteristic. We need concrete. Concrete is the most used material on earth. Unless you find another concrete, it's going to be very difficult to cut emissions. Same can be said about aluminium. So we need to find materials that can do those same or better aluminiums and better concretes and work on that basis.
Giorgio, while we've got you, going back to this issue of cost, you've got an opinion on this. So, you know, is in terms of housing affordability, is this one of the levers?
I don't think so, because fundamentally you can reduce the cost of building by a certain amount, but who's going to benefit for that? A lot of prefabrication you see today is geared towards cutting construction time that might be pocketed directly by the head contractor, if not by the subcontractors. And so ultimately, I don't see the mechanisms today in place, particularly in class 2 buildings, for example, where there is an interest to pass any of these benefits to those who will buy those residences. Yeah. If we have a procurement system that fundamentally is geared towards the contractors and the developers, because it puts a maximum guaranteed price, and it gives basically incentives to cut cost and time. Now, without being an expert of construction management, you know, there's a fundamental rule that when you reduce cost and time, quality is not going to go up. And so ultimately, prefabrication is being geared, and it's coming mostly from a private sector in order to provide benefits to the construction industry, and not necessarily to pass this to the public.
I think it's a perfect one for DAMIAN to respond to.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think when you talk about the cost, I always go to the back end. So, for example, if you're going to own an asset for a very long time, you want a very high quality, high performing asset. And this is where I think prefabrication will start to make more sense and start to be used, because as we see the growth of the build to rent models, and we have large institutional investors coming in, they want high performing and low cost, low life cycle cost products. And that's what prefabrication can provide. So I think once that is understood a bit more, we will see a lot more growth, and you'll see that the initial CapEx is insignificant into the life cycle of that asset. And so, for example, you know, the build to rent model, if the maintenance costs, the facilities management, I mean, that to me is the untapped part of this. Is, as Giorgio said, you know, with the amount of data, with the design, with these digital technologies that are available now, you know, you can build a building, a prefab building, and you can actually, once it's built with digital technologies, you can peel back the layers of each wall and see exactly what's behind it, where it was built, what was put where. So you know exactly what you've got as built. You can't do that on conventional buildings, because we all know how things change on site and things don't always get done the way they should be. The as-builts are never accurate. But in prefab, you get that, and you get a complete understanding of every component, the supply chain, you know, where it's come from, who it was made by, when it was made, when it needs maintenance. And that data, that information is very valuable to someone who owns an asset. So when you're talking about, you know, the emergence of build to rent, I think prefabrication is going to be one of the main ways of delivering that type of product.
I think that's a really important point, Damien. I mean, this push for the public housing renewal projects that we've seen in Victoria recently, which are pushing a 50-50 split of social versus build to rent. I think it's a completely different mindset for a developer to think about a building they've got to look after for 40 years at least, and how they approach that. The difference between build to sell and build to rent, it is a completely different asset class, and I think it will change behaviours, and it will change attitudes to quality and materiality.
Absolutely. I mean, there's not really much, you know, if the traditional developer model is you hand over the keys, you walk away, and you hope you don't get a phone call, and you know, and you've got very minimal responsibilities to that asset that you've delivered. So it is a completely different model and mindset. Agreed. So hopefully that is going to be one of the levers, Alan, that will make that change.
And I think we saw another big government announcement yesterday, federal level commitment to affordable housing and social housing. So again, in construction jobs. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Now, just to go back to some of the questions in the Q&A, there was one about finance in terms of stage payments, which I thought was maybe worth looking at. You know, obviously a lot of bank funding comes with stage payments. So how do we deal with that in a factory condition? Is that something you've come across, Damien?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, it has been one of the key advocacy pieces that Prefab Oz has been focusing on, and we're actually running a project on it right now. But so what seems to have happened is that the offsite construction industry has inherited the contractual terms of a traditional building. And so with that, you know, it's made it challenging, and it is a completely different way of building. So that has been a barrier to growth, and it's been identified, and there's a project underway, an advocacy project that we're undertaking to look at that. So involving banks, insurance companies, contractors and manufacturers around how can we change the the traditional contractual terms to be more suited to manufacturing. So it has been, from what I've experienced, an issue. Still to date, I mean, really the only way you can do it is you've got to get a bank guarantee. You've got to put the bank guarantee up against what you've got in the factory, which means you've actually got to have that money. And therefore, you know, if you're doing significant projects of millions of dollars, you're basically holding that cost until the building goes to site and you can get paid. So, you know, that is a problem, that is a challenge, and that's something that we're focusing on with Prefab Oz. So we'd be keen to hear from anybody who wants to contribute or wants to participate in that project as well, because we will be engaging and running a few more roundtables in the coming months with the banking sector and the insurance sector around that issue.
Great. I think that covers off quite a few of the Q&A questions about finance and risk. Now, Joyce, I'd quite like to come back to you. I mean, and this is maybe a provocation for Giorgio, but back to this issue of research. I mean, where, in terms of people like AECOM, and where you're finding research and evidence and data, is there enough out there? Are you learning on the job, as it were? Are you basically prototyping and testing as you go with projects, or do you think there is research out there in Australia, but also internationally, enough in this area?
I think as AECOM, we're a global organization, so I think we are a little bit more privileged in leveraging from, you know, what our counterparts are actually doing in the other parts of the world. So, for example, like in the UK, we have actually the designers, from the designer's perspective, we are developing, you know, library of products, kit of parts, so to assist what we call proof of concept. So we talk about, you know, the designers lacking the experience of actually knowing how to piece things together, assemble things together. So we're doing in a way, a digital twin that what we're going to do on site. And what we're going to do is proof of concept that it can actually come together from the design's perspective. And then that gets translated to the on site, and that happens literally physically. So, and then we can cross-check and then get the data back into our model and tweak it for the next project to come. So this is where things are actually trending in terms of offsite and prefabrication. Yeah. So a little bit of hands-on learning on the job, as well as, you know, leveraging from what we have, or case studies that we have before. Yeah.
Yeah, Alan, if I can jump in on the research aspects. Obviously, there's a lot that can be done more. There's a lot of research already happening. My personal experience in this field has been that often you are, as an academic or as a researcher that tries to work in a public interest, you're often confronted with very significant barriers of commercial interests. So that you either need to have the capital to do the research that you wouldn't have unless you have a private partner. The problem with private partners is that whilst they resolve the problem of capital, they often come to the table with the outcome. They say, well, we need to show that this works. And now this might work in some sectors, but in the built environment, sometimes you have to be prepared to dig out a little bit and also indicate what the problems are. Now, this is not to say there couldn't be areas of overlap. I think what Damien was saying before about procurement could be an interesting one, because it requires a cultural shift, and there could be areas of overlap. But very often my perception is that there is research that is out there that is fundamentally being preconceived from the beginning, which from an integrity point of view, it's really not going to help in the long run.
Yeah,
that's a good point too, Giorgio, because prefab or modular offsite, it doesn't work for everything. You know, there are some building types, some typologies that it doesn't make sense to do prefabricated. So, and I think there's not enough understanding of the process that, you know, more often than not, what I've seen in the past is a client would come to you with a building that's already designed and go, well, here, build a prefab. It's like, well, we can't just do that. You know, we need to be talking to you at the beginning. We need to understand what are the needs, what is the outcome you're looking for. And then if we can help with a solution, then we work collaboratively from the beginning. And I think it's another thing that we like to do at Prefab Oz at the moment is to really investigate all of the building typologies, look at the different materials and systems that are available, and have a quick reference guide that people can quickly say, you know, if I'm doing this type of building in this location, then prefabrication is an option or it's not. And if it is, then these are the paths you can go down. It could be a hybrid, it could be timber, it could be steel, it could be concrete, it could be all these different things. So I think if we can develop those sorts of tools as well, then we can educate and we can really help people not waste their time at the beginning of a project and really get to the point of where does the prefab or the modular make sense? And let's focus directly on that for a good outcome for the project. So that's something that we're working on at Prefab Oz as well.
Good point that you made, Damien, actually. Actually, when you said about, you know, we only default to offsite at a very, very late stage. So it becomes too late and you don't get a chance to, you know, reap the benefits from modular construction or offsite construction. So in a way, we need to shift our thinking to have a default mode instead of traditional. But the default mode is actually offsite. Because if you design offsite, you can actually build it traditionally. It doesn't really matter. But if you design traditional, you can't actually build in prefabricated. So having that security by designing DFMA, you will give you the options. So, but having that as a default mode would actually help things move along, more uptake on offsite. Yeah.
Damien, I just want to come back to one of your opening comments about skills in particular, because you talk there about I suppose the reassurance that there is a supply chain, so people know what they're working with. And quite a few people in the Q&A have talked about the big housing build, or the big build in general, and some of the infrastructure. I mean, we've got, you know, the suburban rail loop, and you've got all the 14 new precincts that are going to evolve. You know, we do have a pipeline now. Government have set some targets over the next 4 to 5 years, and then hopefully all going well into the next 10 years. So what do we need to do politically, or what do we need to do to change the politics of this?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, you know, and Joyce can probably respond here too, because she's been working with the OPV and doing interviews. But so the Office Projects Victoria have got this, you know, significant infrastructure pipeline coming. And what they are doing is engaging now with the prefab industry. So they've been interviewing and surveying and trying to understand what are the challenges, how do they do this better, how do they engage with the industry. And, you know, some of the feedback, and I'll go back to it, I think I made the comment in the beginning, is just a transparency. And the more transparent that they can be, or that any client can be with the pipeline and what they want to deliver, then the more equipped the offsite industry is to invest in people and equipment and robotics and automation and all those things which are going to help to deliver a much higher quality product and bring the costs down over time.
Yeah, and I suppose that touches on import and export. I mean, someone asked that question early on in the Q&A about, you know, we've been reliant on importing a lot of materials, and there has been, look, there's been significant problems in terms of quality assurance. So again, it's another way of mitigating some of that concern, and driving local manufacturing. Yeah.
So probably just to add on to what Damien was saying, what Damien said, we are being engaged by OPB, the DTF's part of DTF, to actually do this survey. And I think our finding is that although yes, the government come forward and say, yes, we have a huge pipeline of work, all great. But if they don't engage with industry, having that workshop to understand what the issues are, and then come up with a procurement methodology or approach that actually suits the industry and what the industry can actually deliver, then it is not setting up for success. It is setting up for failure in the first place. So I think having that engagement with the industry, like the Prefab Oz or, you know, the supply chain, I think that would help facilitate and move this forward.
Thanks, Joyce. Well, look, I'm just conscious of time. And one of the things I thought it'd be quite good just to kind of trying to wrap up things is, I mean, one of the things, Joyce, I'm curious about is where you'd like to see the industry in the next 5 years. and what do we need to do? What's some short-term opportunities for us to get there?
Where I would like to see the industry, obviously a lot more off-site construction, and I think having our engineers and designers equipped with the skills to actually bridge that gap, having the clients and all the stakeholders buying into the project, and embedding sustainability, embodied carbon into our design, and especially what Damian said about reuse and recycle. I think thinking long-term instead of short-term, what we're currently doing is very, very short-sighted. We are solving problems for the present. We're not solving for problems for the future. What we are doing is creating problems for the future instead of, solving it. So I think we have to be collectively coming together, put our best ideas forward, and moving forward from here. Yeah.
Right. And Damian, I mean, you've obviously taken on, you've been with Prefab Oz from the very outset, but you've obviously taken on your new role. And what's your kind of ultimate goal over the next 5 years in terms of your new role?
Yes, thanks, Alan. Look, I think what we're starting to see is really this emergence of prefab and modular offsite as mainstream. And for me, going back to when we founded Prefab Oz back in 2012 at the Melbourne University event, one of the key focuses for us was, and a lot of discussion was around our name, Prefab Oz. And it was, well, there's a negative connotation to that. Most people believe prefab is a temporary classroom or a mining donga or some sort of substandard, temporary, poorly performing accommodation. We took that challenge on, we took that name on because we wanted to change the perception of prefab. And we did that by showcasing amazing buildings, architect design, beautiful homes, high-rise buildings, hospitals, healthcare, aged care, all types of different buildings from the building sector. So I think what we want to see, and in the next 5 years, is we want to continue to showcase, amazing, beautiful projects that are being delivered. And in Australia, we're world leading. We have so much technology. We have so many amazing companies doing great things in this space. We have companies that are exporting IP. We have companies that are exporting buildings. I mean, and I'll give you an interesting example. Timber Building Systems, they import one of their main materials from New Zealand, a product called Triboard. They take that, they process that into whole building components and export it back as buildings to New Zealand. I mean, this is really interesting stuff. So what I want to see is I want to see more buildings being delivered. We want to see a lot more of the tier 1 builders coming on board. We already have companies like Mirvac. We have them on the board of Prefab Oz. They have a real push in the prefabrication space, and they're seeing the benefits. They've got case studies around the work that they've done in that space. You've got companies like Lendlease who've just been awarded the Pathway 144 project, which is the mental health beds delivery for the Victorian government. You've got companies like Multiplex now with bathroom pods and CLT and starting to implement, hybrid type approaches to their construction. So we just want to see more of this. We want to showcase more of this. We want to educate the industry on what's happening. As I said earlier, I just don't think that most people really understand the advancements that have been made and the digital technologies that have been used at the front end with the architecture. And we need to translate that through the industry and what that means for on-site and for prefabrication and the growth of the industry. So, we see significant growth. I think the next 3 years, to be honest, are going to be big. They're going to be really big years. And in 5 years, it'll be interesting to see where we are. We've always had this, goal of growing from approximately 3% to 10% of industry, and we still believe that we can achieve that.
Great, thanks, Damian. And I'll come to Giorgio in a second, given the, I think looping back to the conversation around what we can do is from a teaching perspective. But I think one of the points that quite a few people have made in the chat, and Bernadette's just highlighted that the role of the advantages of prefab, when we start to look at things like disasters and with the bushfires before COVID hit, and the ability to rebuild quickly as well. And I know there was a lot of conversation about where prefabrication could play a part in that. So, I mean, just to thank everyone for their comments in the Q&A. I'll come to you, Giorgio. So, what can we do better? I mean, we've touched on the research side of it, but do we really need to rethink some of our teaching practices?
Probably. I think we need to invest more in technical competence,
yeah,
and in investing also in students, in giving them an understanding that they have a big responsibility in their hands, and that they will have many risks facing, but the only way to really mitigate those risks to become more accountable, and therefore they have to commit to more knowledge and more skills, but skills that are lifelong, not just looking at the latest fashion of digital software.
Absolutely. And I think, look, it brings me to the kind of conclusion, but I mean, I think from a university perspective, it's fair to say that our investment into Fisherman's Bend is exactly to try and fill this gap. The engineering and design campus that we're going to create over the next 5 years is, that's one of the opportunities for us to try and really resolve some of this from a teaching and a research point of view, and actually to be able to fabricate and learn through making. So big opportunities there, I think, to maintain that conversation with Prefab Oz and companies like AECOM. So I just want to say, look, a huge thank you to Joyce, to Damien and Giorgio for attending. Thanks to everyone who's listened in and for all the comments in the chat. And Simon, back to you.
Yep, no, thanks so much. I don't think I have much to add there, Alan. Thanks so much again to our panelists today. There was a really good conversation. You covered so much ground. That was wonderful. A lot of insights. Thank you to our audience today for joining us, for submitting your questions, and we hope you enjoyed this panel conversation. We will be sending around a link to the video recording of this session, probably on Monday morning, and please feel free to share it with friends and colleagues who might be interested. So once more, thank you all, and we look forward to having you with us at the next event. Thank you.
Good, thanks everyone.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Bye.